Hi, I'm Oliver, and this is Deep Cuts, a channel dedicated to music for lovers of music. As I wrote in the description of this video, I've been wanting to cover Afrobeat for quite a long time. To be honest, ever since I started the channel, it was something I wanted to cover. But I felt as if I hadn't listened to enough of the records, I didn't understand where Afrobeat came from enough. So I've taken the time over the past few years to really familiarise myself with the scene that it came out of, with the country that it came out of, really try and understand how this music came to be. And I feel like now I have enough confidence to be able to speak about it with you. Afrobeat is a genre of music from West Africa which takes some of the traditions of Western music and fuses it with those West African musical elements. The style was coined by Mr. Fela Kuti, a name you definitely will have heard of at some point, the man who brought Afrobeat to Nigeria. He took the improvisational spirit of jazz, intoxicating funk, traditional African rhythms, and a scathing socio-political context. A proto-version of Afrobeat could be found in Ghana in the early 1920s. This was a place where African music was being played on traditional Western instruments, and this came to be known as high life. So you do have a proto-version of the Afrobeat style there. And this is one of those instances where cultural homogenization happens and it collides two disparate ideas of arts and culture in the world that we live in. In this instance, it was because of colonialism. Fela's visit to Ghana, coupled with the infatuation that he had from jazz, from working in London and studying in London, helped birth this original, vibrant style of music. He actually travelled to London to become a doctor initially, and then when he was there, seeing all these fantastic jazz musicians playing, he realised this just really wasn't his calling, so he ended up at the Trinity College of Music and continued building that musical style. The man was arrested 200 times by the Nigerian police and military, and if that doesn't show you how much of a fierce opponent he was to the military system, I don't know what will. He was only convicted once, and that one time was only due to the military putting so much pressure on the judge in question to give him a harsh sentence, because he was later freed. He was so anti-government and anti-military that even though he died in 1997, a number of radio stations in Nigeria still don't play his music for fear of feeling as if they're speaking out against the establishment, which is quite a powerful thing if you think about it. Apparently even the school system has spoken out against Fela in the past. One example I can think of is there was an exam question which of these Nigerian nationals is not a cultural hero? And the answer was Mr. Kuti. So you see what an incredible legacy this man birthed, not only a political one which spoke to the hearts of many Nigerians that felt they were being attacked by their own government and their own military, but also musically as well. He created this very beautiful style of music which has the socio-political consciousness, but also is just a great sound. As you might have already gleaned from what I've said so far, one of the big proponents of Afrobeat is the rhythmic side of things, so African polyrhythms. Now polyrhythms, a quick primer for you if you don't know what a polyrhythm is, it's essentially cross rhythms, so different rhythms which interweave to create an increasing complexity of rhythmic devices in the music. So this happens a lot, and this really is the lifeblood of African music, and it's the lifeblood of Afrobeat. It makes this style so colourful, and it's so integral to this style that Mr. Kuti was making and also other Afrobeat musicians. It means not only do you have the jazz, funk and soul flex motifs in the music often played on Western instruments, but you also have the West African percussion playing these polyrhythms, working against the traditional drum kit, and you have them performed on things like akuba, congas, sticks, shakirs. Not to mention the size of the Afrobeat bands adds a lot to the intensity and the energy of the performances. Many of Kuti's bands were 20 or more performers, which you can imagine really does add to the intensity of that music, the intensity of the polyrhythms. Before I jump in, there are a number of records that you could check out that are considered maybe offshoots of Afrobeat or proto-versions of Afrobeat. Geraldo Pinho's Heavy Heavy Heavy, which was said to be a big influence on Fela Kuti, although much more of a straight funk sound than the more propulsive Afrobeat sound. Also check out William Onyeba's excellent record Atomic Bomb, which is, to be honest, more of a kind of synth funk sound than anything, but does have roots in the general Afrobeat sound. But anyway, let's do it. Number one, Orlando Julius with Super Afro Soul, released in 1966. So I'm starting with a record that for many years was unheard by much of the world until it resurfaced as a reissue for us all to enjoy. And of course this is Orlando Julius's Super Afro Soul, because I just told you the title of it, which actually features a younger Fela Kuti performing on trumpet before he picked up the saxophone. Orlando Julius didn't deliver the same style that Fela did with his music. However, it's not difficult to see the cross-cuts between the two different artists. This is a tighter record, I suppose. It's less improvised. We have 3-minute songs, which makes it feel more like an R&B or soul record from the 60s, but you do have those West African polyrhythms in the mix, making it sound like that Afrobeat sound. I'm not going to talk about this record for too long because it's not a completely formed example of Afrobeat. I do think this is proto-Afrobeat, but it's so fascinating to hear where these Western instruments and Western sounds were fusing with the West African sounds to get this very unique style. A track like Jagu and Nana delivers tight production, which gets more and more intense as the track moves forward, which shows you how much of an important driving force percussion is in this Afrobeat sound, and it really does bring together the Western elements, the West African elements. Or Souled Hit, which is an instrumental track allowing the band to really let rip and go full force without the vocal delivery that's centrally tied to all the rest of the tracks, that pins down the rest of the tracks. And again, doing that, it shows that there's this move towards Afrobeat. In Afrobeat, we have more improvisation, we have more opportunities for soloing, and that's where the jazz influence comes from. There's less of that on this record, but the fact that there is an instrumental on this record, I think starts to show you a push towards that style. It's a beautiful record anyway, you should definitely listen to it. Let me know what you think. Number 2, Fela Kuti with Zombie, released in 1976. So I've already briefly talked about Mr. Fela Kuti, the man who married 27 women in one day. Yes, that's true. And he brought Afrobeat to the world in its fully formed idea. There are so many fascinating anecdotes and stories from the life of Fela Kuti. I don't have time to talk about many of them, but I do suggest you check out the authorized biography if you want to read about some more of this, which is called Fela, This Bitch of a Life. It is rich, it's full of great anecdotes, and you will have much more of a fully formed understanding of the man's political opinions, his music, his upbringing, if you do read that. Here's a wonderful quote from him. "Music is a weapon of the future. Music is the weapon of the progressives. Music is the weapon of the givers of life." I start with this quote because, as I've already said, he was very political, antagonizing the establishment of Nigeria with every single opportunity that he got, specifically in his music. It also perfectly frames 1976's Zombie, a record with a title that alludes to the military individuals, the people that worked in the military, those soldiers, as if they were these zombies, just facelessly doing the bidding of the establishment. And this is an act which ended up with about 1,000 soldiers turning up at Kuti's commune, burning it down and throwing his elderly mother out of a third-story window. Yeah. This is how much of a threat the military saw Kuti and his anti-establishment agenda. Presumably the popularity of Kuti's music was spreading more, and the military saw that, and they didn't want the anti-establishment sentiment to spread along with it. Aside from the political ramifications, this is simply one of the best Afrobeat albums of all time, and also one of the most popular. I absolutely could not leave it out. Kuti played all manner of instruments, and his real power was leading his band, in this case the Africa 70, but he also played saxophone and keyboards, and occasionally would jump on drum kits for solos, play a little bit of guitar. He did a little bit of everything, but primarily sax, keyboards, and just leading this huge band. Straight away, Zombie gives you a potent hit of the Afrobeat sound. You get 2 tracks on the original recording, about 13 minutes apiece. The first one's called Zombie, the second one's called Mr. Follow Follow. If you check out the record now on streaming services, you'll probably see that it's 4 tracks long, because you have the 2 additional tracks of Observation No Crime and then a live recording called Mistake. The beginning of Zombie lays down a funked up guitar phrase as Fela and drummer Tony Allen kick off the track in full force. Now, Tony Allen is a very important person in the world of Afrobeat. He didn't just define Fela Kuti's Afrobeat sound, but also the Afrobeat sound as a whole. He laid his percussive lines down on so many defining and visionary Afrobeat records. I don't think Afrobeat would sound the same without his input. There's this excellent interview in the Wire magazine with Tony Allen where he talks about, he noticed when he was in America and watching some of the American jazz greats like Elvin Jones and Art Blakey that they were using the hi-hat pedal and open hi-hats all the time, and his fellow highlife players weren't doing that, and he was confused at why that was, because it's just an extra opportunity to add more rhythms into the sound. So he started doing that, and people were looking at him going, why are you doing that? But you know, it ended up becoming one of the defining features of the Afrobeat sound. You can hear this constant process of motion on the track Zombie. You have the hi-hat pedal going alongside the dynamic snare parts, the wonderful horns, the steady cowbell. It all interweaves to create these polyrhythms. The backing vocals on the track Zombie make the record feel larger than life, but crucially they never outshine Fela's vocals on a very zestful vocal performance that has more than a hint of that political zeal about it. The second track, Mr. Follow Follow, is more of a slow burn track. It wants you to settle into that groove. It's maybe slightly less energetic, but there's nothing better than just laying back into the sound of this band, keeping on that repetition all the way through. For such a large band, it's important to know that this record is snare drum tight, to be honest. Everything sounds perfect, nothing sounds out of place. It's incredibly well realised for such a large band. Famously, if anyone wasn't up to scratch on a performance day, Fela would tell them to leave. He was an absolute perfectionist with his sound, and you can hear that coming through on these recordings. And it's in this constant repetition and process of motion that Afrobeat finds its true power. You really feel as if those grooves on Zombie will go on forever. And to be honest, you want them to go on forever. That's part of their power. If you want to hear Afrobeat, you have to listen to this record. Number 3, Monomono with Give the Beggar a Chance, released in 1972. I'm jumping back a few years now because I wanted to talk about Zombie before I talked about this record. Monomono is a group led by the wonderful vocal of Johnny Harstrup, a Nigerian who grew up in a royal household, who was exposed to a wide variety of music styles from all around the world ever since he was young. If you take the time to listen to Orlando Julius's Super Afro Soul, the record I just spoke about earlier, you will recognise the dynamic vocal ability of Harstrup. It's a very different kind of vocal delivery to something like Fela, who has a very gruff economy to his style. Harstrup formed Monomono in 1971 with a bassist, guitarist and percussionist, and they got together and recorded Give the Beggar a Chance and then released it in the following year. Now, one of the most interesting things about this LP is its marked difference to the sound that Fela made, that horn-flecked, horn-tinged sound of his Afrobeat. This has a much rockier edge to it, this record, complete with some gorgeous guitar solos from Jimmy Adams and some genuinely infectious funk solos on the bass. Like, you just want those funk motifs to go on forever and ever, a bit like the Fela record. I think this is a wonderful record, but just quite different in its approach. At times, this band manages to sound like some kind of bluesy West African psychedelia, which I guess makes sense for a band leader who ended up going to play keys for Ginger Baker, drummer of Cream. The percussion on this record isn't quite as frenetic as on Zombie, but that's because there are less percussionists. It's a smaller band, but there are still those unmistakable polyrhythms weaving in and out of each other, keeping the percussive side of the record, the rhythmic focus of the record at the forefront, as an Afrobeat record should. It does mean the music has slightly less urgency. It's a more laid back approach to Afrobeat, I think. The opening title track has guitar and key lines converging into this very upbeat groove, which establishes a slightly more meandering version of Afrobeat and the style that this record takes pretty much throughout. A track like The World Might Fall Over is where things get slightly more psychedelic, with Harstrup's chilling scream at the beginning and an instrumental that is fairly reminiscent of Maggot Brain by Funkadelic. The organ sound dominates many of these tracks, with percussion lines underneath creating those polyrhythms between traditional drum kit and clave sounds. On Ija Amura Sis, which, let's be honest, is probably incorrectly pronounced because my pronunciation is usually terrible, Jimmy Evans puts in an incredible guitar solo performance piece. It's dripping with blues swagger, and it's moments like that that really make this record land. You have the sultry organ tone, the guitar solo, but you have those polyrhythms keeping everything interesting, keeping it spicy. A great record, one which was actually reissued in 2011, so you can pick it up on vinyl relatively cheap now. And I advise that you do if you are a record collector, because the only way of making this record sound any better is with the warm crackle of wax. Number 4, Femi Kuti with Shoki Shoki, released in 1998. Does the name sound familiar? Huh? It doesn't? You haven't been paying any attention at all then. Femi Kuti is the eldest son of Fela, and his second record, Shoki Shoki, is a goddamn delight. Genuinely, it's probably one of the most infectious records you are likely to hear if you take some time with it and listen to it. Femi was born in 1962 whilst Fela was still in London, but then he subsequently grew up in Nigeria. Having grown up around his father's love for music, but also need to critique the establishment, Femi has in many ways bared the torch that Fela originally held, musically and politically, but he has gone his own way as well and put his own mark, his own stamp on Afrobeat, but also on the way that he criticises Nigeria's political and military establishments. He originally played in Fela's band, so he got to see his father perform and see how he led a band before striking out on his own in the 80s with his band Positive Force, and then his solo records in the 90s. Shoki Shoki is the second Femi Kuti solo record, released in 1998, and it takes the large, grooving full band performances, the political edge, and it updates it to a 90s context without feeling like a cheap imitation of that original Fela Kuti Afrobeat sound, which I personally think is a very impressive achievement. Studying under his father and even leading his band when he was imprisoned by the Nigerian military, Femi knows how to conjure up the exacting force of funk with the complexity of those West African polyrhythms, but he adds his own twist. On Bang Bang Bang, for example, which is a song about sex, if you didn't realise from the title, there's, as well as the kit drummer with his displaced snares, which add a complexity to the line, and all of the percussion as well, you have this driving, sequenced electronic drum rhythm, which makes the whole track feel like a dance track, but not a simplistic dance track, a dance track in the vein of Afrobeat. It turns the track into such a lively piece of music. It doesn't take away from the complexity, but in some ways it adds a simplicity because the dance beat cuts through all of the other parts of the percussion, but it doesn't make them less important. It just adds another layer. Femi's sound is definitely more funk-based than his father's, so gone are the very long, extended solos on records like Zombie or Aphrodisiac. That doesn't make it any less Afrobeat, it's just a slightly different approach. The songs are shorter, they're a little bit more concise, and instead of using the horn sounds to create these very long motifs or horn solos, he uses them to craft these rousing short motifs like on the track What Will Tomorrow Bring. That's not to say we don't get any horn solos, because we do, but these tracks are around 6 minutes long rather than 12 minutes, so we don't get the kind of extended solos or extended instrumental sections that we have on a Fela record. Sorry Sorry is another cracking track on this record, and it reveals this political edge that he has in his music on this record. The crisp funk guitars and warm organ tones create another beautiful track, and it's a track that manages to sound celebratory without losing the political importance of the track, and that's something that Fela managed to do over and over again, and this is part of what Femi does so well. Somehow he's managed to achieve similar things to his father. Obviously his father has that legacy and he could never really take over that. He's never going to be able to beat that kind of legacy. That's just the way it is, unfortunately. But he does a damn good job with his music here in harnessing the same kind of feeling that his father's music had, but also updating it and updating the Afrobeat sound in so many ways. I think it's a brilliant record, and I think you should absolutely take a listen. Number 5, Antibalas with Antibalas, released in 2012. So this is a bit of a weird one to end on. After just talking about the way Femi updated his father's sound to give it a more contemporary edge in some ways, or certainly contemporary in terms of when it was released in the 90s, we land on a group that in many ways apes the sound of the Afrobeat founder, which is exactly why I want to talk about it. A New York-based Afrobeat band, they've been spending years playing the sound of traditional Afrobeat, exactly the kind of Afrobeat music that Fela was making in the 70s. And I suppose you could call them Afrobeat revivalists. Now, I don't think this is actually an amazing record. I think it's a very good record, but not an amazing one. So you might be asking, why the hell have you picked it for a 5 albums to get you into video? Because usually you say every single record is fantastic. Well, I think more than anything, the fact that arguably the most prominent band out there right now, being Antibalas, making music that is Afrobeat, sounds so close to the founder's style of music, so Fela's music. It sounds exactly like Fela Kuti, without Fela's voice, basically. And I think that's important if you want to talk about Afrobeat, because really Afrobeat began with one person, which is Fela Kuti, and his name now is ringing around my head because I've said his name so many times in this video, but that's just because that's how this genre came about. Yes, we have people like Orlando Julius, Geraldo Pino, lots of other players creating a mixture of sounds from high life and updating that in Nigeria and Ghana, but Fela, the way that he created his music, brought the sounds of Afrobeat to the rest of the world and to Nigeria in a very popular way. And I think just the fact that a band would be making music still now, and this record in 2012 that sounds exactly like that, proves the prominence and popularity of the music that Fela was making. So much so that a number of the performers in Antibalas, and it's kind of a revolving lineup, actually ended up in the pit band for Fela the Musical, and that musical's been a smash success. It's an off-Broadway musical, it's been playing numerous times over the years. But yeah, these players know exactly how to make the style of Fela Kuti work in a live setting, and they've proven that in these Broadway performances. This self-titled record is Antibalas' 5th LP, and whilst I might be alluding to this idea that they're struggling for their own identity, I guess that's somewhat missing the point. They're supposed to be making music that sounds just like Fela Kuti's Afrobeat, which is something they do very, very well. The magic of this group of musicians is that they believe so strongly in the musical vision of Fela that they somehow managed to pull off a similar kind of intensity. Femi did it, but he updated it slightly. Monomono did it before, but again in a very different way, in a slightly rocked up, psychedelic kind of way. But Antibalas play very close to that influence, and they don't end up coming across as trite or banal as a result. The opening track, Dirty Money, is produced in a way that sounds as if it could have come from the same era as Fela. Everything sounds so warm, the guitars, the vocals, the horn parts. One of the best tracks on the record, Him Belly Go No Sweet, has one of those horn motifs that will be stuck in your head for so long you might actually get irritated by it. It's the kind of motif that Fela's band would have endlessly riffed on for half an hour in a live performance, and it's that good that they genuinely could have done that. The final track, Ser Con Con, is 10 minutes long, and it showcases how tight this musical collective really are. The drums are muted, which makes the horn parts feel even more alive, even more trebly. It's a striking production decision that really pays off in this instance. Politically, the band seems to be making the similar strides that Fela was making. Dirty Money is a title which seems as if it's related to the Occupy Wall Street movement, which was big in 2012. That was such a large part of the political sentiment. So yes, it's not the most original Afrobeat record, but that's the point. The point is that Fela's music was so single-handedly defined as Afrobeat music that this band are finding success in creating great music by doing almost exactly the same sound, or replicating the same sort of sounds that Fela was making in the 70s and the 80s. So I think it's important to listen to a record like this, for sure. It's also a particularly tight piece of work which is done with care and love, and it does deserve to be listened to as a result of that. And that's it, that's my 5 albums to get you into Afrobeat. I'm glad I did this one, really good fun, some great music to get stuck into. If you've never listened to Afrobeat before, please come and join me on the Deep Cuts Discord on Tuesday at 10 o'clock BST, where we'll be listening to Fela Kuti's Zombie. It's a great record. I feel like we're all just going to be grooving in our seats with our headphones on, chatting about how great this record is. So please come and join me if you're interested. Thanks for watching as always. Thank you to my patrons. I'll see you next week.